Good morning, and thank you, Jack. Good name, Jack. Maybe as a way of a little bit of an introduction, tell you a little bit about my farm, and by today's standards, I'm a real small farmer. Between what my wife and I own, rent, and custom farm, we're still less than 1,000 acres, but it's pretty much a one-man operation, so that's plenty for one person. I shouldn't say one person. My wife does help some and helps quite a bit and get me around and everything, so that's quite appreciated as well. But anyway, raise, as Jack had already indicated, raise commercial corn, seed corn, soybeans, and in the last 3 years I've added some cereal rye to the cropping plans in order to grow my own cover crop seed and be able to I also do custom cover crop seeding, and so to have seed available to do some of that as well. Our farm is also a century farm, and the story I love to tell about that is my wife's grandfather settled a farm. Her dad was born in the house that we now live in. He lived for 94 years, having never left the home, and died in the home. So he left us quite a legacy that I'll never fulfill because it's not going to be there. But anyway, and his motto is he wanted that ground and that farm to be left in better shape than it was when he received it. But my wife and I do share that philosophy, so we want to try to keep improving the ground, improving the land. And these are some of the things that I'm trying to learn to see how I might be able to do that. And some of the things that I'm going to share with you, like Jack had already said, you may disagree, but these are things that I've found that have worked for me or not worked, as the case may be. But your results may be different. You've got different climates, you've got different management. Your goals may be different, and when you're working with cover crops or even strip till, that's one of the very important things is to what is your goal, and because how you're going to treat the cover crops and some of those things is really dependent on what you're trying to accomplish with it. So I'll talk a little bit about soil health and what my understanding of soil health is, trying to get it more simplified. And this was a diagram that I thought really kind of helped bring it home for me. Talk a little bit about why cover crops, and then I'll share with you some of the research data I've done over the last 4 or 5 years. And for those that glaze over when you hear data, I'm sorry. Okay, so soil health. For the last 50 years, we've spent a lot of time worrying about the physical aspects of the soil. Do we get the aggregate size? Do we get it smoothed out? And working in those kinds of things. And there's been a lot of effort put in that. And the chemical side. We've added commercial fertilizers to be sure that our nutrients are available there. But over the last 50 years, we've not paid much attention to the biological aspects. And with this cover crop movement, if you want to call it that, or the re-interest in cover crops, the biological aspect of it is one of the main pieces of it. But I call it's back to the future. Because my fathers, grandfathers, and they had a similar approach. They had pasture, they had row crops, they had hay, and they kind of rotated those. They had some green manure crops. They did it a little differently, but many of the same, and they put manure out there, and many of the same principles applied. But the diagram, where all of those intersect and work together, that's where you get soil health. And like I say, this diagram is not original with me, but it kind of helped me understand it, and I appreciated that. So, and the purpose of soil health is, to sustain biological productivity. It really helps with environmental quality and working through that. Promote plant, animal, and human health. And so then we can move into why cover crops. Probably all of you have seen a farm that looks like this. Now, maybe it wasn't your farm, but it's probably your neighbor's farm or whatever. But anyway, you see those ruts coming down through the field. That's a bad deal, because with that dirt that's moving, likely there's some phosphorus moving, and you may have lost some nitrogen either through leaching or other means. And so the way I look at that, that's money. That's like having a hole in your money bag and you're just dribbling out there and it's just washing down to your neighbors or wherever else. And so I paid for that nutrient I'd like for it to stay on the field. So to me, that's one of my motivations for cover crops. I participated with Iowa State on a capstone. The seniors at in the ag engineering department, or ag tech department anyway, have a project every year, and they put a team of students together, and a friend of mine gives them a project, and I was a consultant on that. But anyway, we had gave them some parcel of land. They did the topography and looked at it in different ways and what is there. And in that, that's not going to work. But anyway, hopefully you can read it. Their analysis of it estimated there was about 2.4 tons of soil loss. In Iowa, at least, I think T is 5 tons. It's supposed to be an acceptable amount, so this is very small in that regard. But in any case, what might happen if we just added cover crops? He was conventional. He'd been doing it conventional all along, so what if we added cover crops to it? What effect might that have? And so these were all analytical studies, but in doing that, and it cut the amount of soil loss by a little over half. Didn't change anything else, had the same waterways. In the spring, he went back to his conventional tillage, but just in that blank time, he had cover crops on the ground, and through the snow melt and such, it helped hold the soil. So they took another look, come back to that same situation, comparing it against what he'd been doing all along, and we added no-till with the cover crops. Still had his waterways as before, but he did no-till instead of conventional till. That took nearly all of the erosion away. And like I say, these were not highly sloping soils, so normally you wouldn't think there'd be a whole lot, but these are some things that at least maybe it wouldn't be exactly, but they're possible. And so this was a slide that I borrowed from Doug Peterson. And anyway, he talked about, U.S.-wide, the average is about 7.5 tons of soil loss per year. And the data he had suggested that's $40 an acre in nutrients that get away. And looking at U.S. as a total cost, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $27 billion with a B. So there's lots of dollars that potentially could be worldwide $400 billion. So there's lots of opportunity there if we can learn how to get this to work in our system. And that getting it to work in your system is a little different for each one, perhaps, because of different goals. I talked about the goals earlier, and this is just a slide, and I'm sorry it's so small you probably can't read it, but I'll give you the source later on a later side, and you can take a picture of it or whatever. But anyway, it's listing some of the goals along the side. And, for me, erosion, organic matter, and nutrient cycling are my 3 primary goals why I'm doing cover crops. And this chart lists some various crops that help contribute to those goals. And so that's when you think about that, again, what are your goals? And because I'm in a soybean seed corn rotation, and the home farm that's a Century Farm has got 75 years of history of growing seed corn. And when you have a seed corn soybean rotation, you're not putting much back in that soil. And so we've seen the organic matter deteriorate in that soil. And my father-in-law believed that every 6 or 7 years, he'd pull out of the seed corn rotation, grow commercial corn for a few years, just to slow down the rate of degradation. And so I thought, hey, if I could do something like cover crops where I wouldn't have to pull out of that seed corn rotation, that also can help. There's some other tools that are available to kind of help you with that selection of those cover crops. This is one that's by the USDA, and they list all these crops, and you can click on any one of those, and I'll do the one that kind of, there's serial right. It'll bring up a sheet like this, and for each one of those crops, you get a little data sheet on it, and so it kind of gives you some of the details of what might be available and what are its purposes, what are its advantages, what are its disadvantages to help contribute to those. And so that's a useful tool. Another thing to think about is this is an issue that I've had with the NRCS and working with them to try to make some changes. Most of their recommendations are based on pounds of seed per acre. A pound is not a pound is not a pound, because I took VNS rye versus Elbon cereal rye, counted out the seeds, and you see there at the bottom, the equivalent of 56 pounds of VNS, you get the same number of seeds with like 35 pounds, 36 pounds of Elbon. So that we need to move to seeds per acre, just like you do for corn or whatever else, and not pounds per acre. Working with the state NRCS office and trying to get that changed, and so that we look at that. Certainly, if we could go to seeds per acre, you know, there's some tremendous cost reduction, and I've got experience with 35 pounds of Elbon. You've got equal to or better cover crop coverage as you would with the VNS. So that's an opportunity. In my cereal rye growth, I kind of decided to try that because with seed corn you have to isolate away from commercial corn. So I had a place that I was going to have to isolate anyway, and I had an excellent stand of cereal rye on that isolation point just from a cover crop. So I decided to let it go and raise it and harvest it for rye seed. And so looking at that analysis, for this particular year, that was in 2016, you know, the cereal rye that I had been buying for cover crop was costing me about $12 a bushel. And so I go through the economics. Raising that rye seed was way more economical, had a much higher ROI than if I had to put soybeans like I normally do on those isolation strips. The other advantage is that some of these smaller isolation strips, they wind up being soybeans on soybeans on soybeans on soybeans, and you wind up with problems with those, weeds and diseases and stuff. So this breaks that cycle as well. So there were some other things. But it comes with a caution. The rye market is pretty limited. The majority of the rye today is used for cover crop. If you get some real high quality rye, you can sell some into the food grade market or the whiskey market, but that's pretty limited. So you have to be careful how much of it you grow, or you'll saturate the market, and there you've got a bunch of rye that it can be fed, but it's not nearly as palatable, as I understand, as some of the corn or wheat or some of the other protein products. So now I'll move on into some of the other research that I've done looking at cover crops in various ways. But most of my research is cooperated with Practical Farmers of Iowa. I've done some with the Soybean Association. I've done some with Iowa State. But this particular one, it started in 2014. It was on a seed corn field. And so the first planting date you see there is just when they destroyed the male rows. I went in there, and a neighbor of mine had this little tractor with a loader on it, so I rigged up something so I could kind of seed some strips in there. The second seeding, it corresponded to, with seed corn, much of it they use a defoliant on it when it's at its physiological maturity, just to shut it down. And so after that I planted some, because my fear was that earlier, if it sprouted, the defoliant would kill it. So I had another date there. Anyway, and then the third one was drilled after harvest. And so just looking at what we get out of all of that. This is the results for nitrogen. This is using the Haney soil test and then the conventional nitrate nitrogen test, looking at that. The first bar is where there were no cover crops, and then the second one was the early planting, third is the second planting, and the third one was the drill, or fourth one was the drill, rather. And this is the total nitrogen both in the soil and in the plant material as plant available nitrogen. You can see in the soil there's quite a bit more nitrogen than there is in the cover crop versions. And what that tells me is much of that nitrogen got moved up into the plant, into the cereal rye during that growing time. And the earlier it was planted, the more it captured. Also, on the average of those three different planting dates, they had 66 pounds more nitrogen available than did the no-cover area. And using 2015 prices, 15 prices, that's worth somewhere between $30 and $35 an acre if you're going into a crop the following year that can use that nitrogen that's captured in that plant material. Also looking at carbon-nitrogen ratio, you can see that in the soils that had the cover crop, they had reduced the nitrogen in there, so you got the nitrogen content in the plant material above, but down in the soils, see it reduced the nitrogen or carbon-nitrogen content. Increased the carbon-nitrogen content in the soils because you had more roots and other things in there that's bringing more carbon down there. So there's that benefit as well. Looking at various let me back up. In this bottom one, the desired carbon-nitrogen ratio is at 8 to 15 or so, and that's really geared around decomposition and releasing those nutrients back to the soil. And a lot of the data suggests that if you get a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio above 20, then that delays that return of those nutrients back to the following crop. Looking at various carbon-nitrogen ratios, that's some of them, the rye straw, that's after it's mature and you just got the straw, it's really, really high. And so just various crops there, you can kind of see what the different carbon-nitrogen ratios would be. So I had those strips in there, and I said, well, what can I continue to learn from on those and keep going? So I looked at different termination dates of those cover crops and how that might affect soybean growth. So on the left there, the first one was the first termination, and that was done with using Roundup. And then the second termination was done a day after it was planting. I happened to use Gramoxone on that. And the lower one is kind of give you an indication at the second termination, kind of how it was, so high. And I got to tell you, that was my first experience planting green. It's an emotional experience the first time you try it, but it all worked out okay. So then later in June, going out to check the crops, look through there, and here's these green stripes through the field. And go out there and look a little closer. The one on the left's the early termination, one on the right's the late termination, the one in the middle is where there was no cover. Well, all that green wasn't soybeans. It was water hemp, mare's tail, and everything else. And so there was a tremendous difference in the weed pressure in there. Doing the stand counts on them, the soybean stand counts were all statistically equal. And so the weed pressure was much higher in that no cover area. So I went ahead and sprayed it using Cobra on those no cover areas only. And you may say $40 an acre is crazy to spend that much money. That's about what it cost me at that particular time, counting both the chemical and the application. I don't do my own spraying. I hire that done. But so anyway, that was my cost in there. And the cereal rye and allocating some money for the application, that's roughly $30 that I had in the cover crop. So the way I calculate that was $10 I saved by not having to put that post-application, because at the end of the year, these two cover crop areas were as clean or cleaner than the area that I had sprayed with Cobra. So then, moving on, trying to get into this earlier planting date, looked at trying to interseed into field corn, and mounted this air seeder on top of my anhydrous bar, and rigged it up so it'd spray it down in front of the knife. Got a good stand on that, think, oh man, I'm on my way now. And so 9 days, you can kind of see the going there. 3 weeks later, got a good stand, growing good. There, it's 6 weeks, the corn's getting tall, and moving on through there, and then up into August, it is graveyard dead. It's shaded out because that corn 12, 13 feet tall. Next year, tried it. I didn't have any commercial corn, went to seed corn. Tried a mix in there. There was a multi-mix, and seed corn's much smaller, got plenty of light. Everything survived. So I've been on a mission now trying to find out what will survive in seed or in commercial corn. But that was a mix, and everything survived in that. Not a lot of biomass at the end of the year, but there's some. The other thing that I got out of that, dug some root pits after I had those. And the black streaks in there are worm trails. And there was one spot there that was a little over 2 foot down. There were 7 worm trails in about a 6 or 8 inch width there. So there was lots of worm activity in the soil after having that high diverse mix out there. And then the next spring, some of the radishes and stuff that was there, it was just full of worms that eaten those up. Next time, I tried applying it a little differently. We've got this old Henniker cedar that I moved in, or Lauren Steinling had moved in, but anyway, planting it, interseeding it into the corn at about V4. So mid-July, this interseeding happened to be cowpeas, annual ryegrass, and rapeseed. So I got a good stand. Just before harvest, it is after frost, those cowpeas just melted. There wasn't much there, so the annual ryegrass and rape was what was left. After harvest, still got some of those. So I've got some growth in there. It survived the whole season, so that was encouraged. I found some things that'll work. This year, got a couple of things going, repeating the 30-inch rows, but this is a comparison of 30-inch rows and 60-inch rows. Now you think I fell off the deep end. But anyway, these 60-inch rows have the same population per acre as does the 30-inch rows. So the spacing's half the size on the plants. But anyway, what that allows is a lot more light down there to the soil, so there's a lot more species can survive in between those. And some of the data from a friend of mine that had been doing these studies without cover crops, he's showing that he's getting equal yields in that 60-inch row that he was the 30-inch row, and it's all about harvesting sunlight. Will that be the case? We'll see this fall. The jury's still out on that, but this is, and I went out there a long ways, 3 acres, so I'm high risking it here. But anyway, we'll see how this turns out. But the cover crops in it are growing good, and in the 30-inch rows they're shading out and looking pretty tough. So my whole point here is encouragement. I'm doing strip till on corn before corn, no till before soybeans, but trying to get cover crops worked into your organization. Start small, kind of like with my 60-inch deal. I'm not trying to plant the whole farm to it, but try a little small thing, figure out how to make it work. If you're new to cover crops, try a single species. I mean, the mixtures are better and they do more work, but sometimes they can be more expensive too, depending on how you work them. Learn from others that are using cover crops. At least in the state of Iowa, and I think it's nationwide now, there's lots of meetings being held around cover crops and how to get them to work, giving you ideas on how to get them to work in your operation. As I said earlier, the climate, so consider all of those things, climate, location, your crop rotation, all those things into the thing as you work toward trying to figure out what your cropping deal or what cover crops will work for you. Some people have tried planting some shorter season varieties on their cash crops in order to get their cover crops planted earlier. Plant some easier cover crops, plant something that'll winter kill if you're concerned about getting it killed in the spring. So there's some things there. There's some decision tools that are available, plus the local expertise, and I'll give you, there's that MCCC, there's a website there, Midwest Cover Crop Council. They've got an excellent tool on that for you to look at that'll help you select some species. Green Cover Seed Smart Mix. It's a company out of Nebraska that sells cover crop seed, but they have got this tool online that's free for anyone to use, and it'll help you select some cover crop seeds for your area, because it takes that all into consideration. This is the Practical Farmers of Iowa has an extensive database of all of the research projects that we have done over the last 30 years. And at this address, you can go in there and search by cover crops, search by various things, and it's available free to the public. You don't have to be a member to access that database. So there's lots of cover crop information in that database. This is the one that shows that chart that I showed you earlier that had the different seeds on there. And so gets them all tied up there so you can see it a little better, those different websites. there's, I think, all good resources that you can use to try to look at them. This is a quote that I saw here recently, and I think it has merit, at least for me it did, and it says, we abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. And until we look at it as part of our community, we probably will continue to do that. So this was from Leopold, of which the Leopold Center at Ames was named after. So anyway, that's a thought, and that is my prepared remarks. You got a question here?
We do have time for questions, but first, how about a round of applause for Jack? So we do have our staff in the audience here, and Joe's walking around. If we have a couple questions, put your hand up, we'll find you. Joe, one right in front here.
I was going to say, could you back up one more screen?
That one or more?
Oh, I think you had the ones where you got all the cover crop seeds, the website. No, yeah.
Cover crop seed.
Yeah, I think it's the way at the end
you're
of
talking about that multicolored one?
Yeah, that multicolor one, yeah.
Maybe I passed over it. Oh, there, that one. The link was on that other page, too.
One question I had for you, Jack. What is your herbicide program before interseeding, as far as your pre-plant and stuff like that goes?
The question, I think, was it, what is the herbicide program before this interseeding?
Correct. Like your burn down or pre-plant.
Generally, on the burn down, my base that I'm using now is cereal rye and rapeseed. And so where I'm going to corn, it is usually gramoxone. And if I don't use gramoxone, then it's Roundup with 2,4-D to kill that rapeseed. Because the deal with rapeseed is some of it has the Roundup Ready canola, because they're real close cousins. And 2,4-D will get it, or gramoxone will get it by itself. So that's the burn down. And then going to soybeans, it's nearly always Roundup.
Joe, a couple in front here.
Right up here.
Mine's pretty simple.
Hold on, if you could wait for the mic so everybody can hear. Thank you.
Yeah, for your 60-inch row corn there, on your higher population, how's your stand been on the corn itself? Has it laid down in any of the wind events or anything along like that?
The question is around the standability of that 60-inch corn. And granted, this is my first year doing it, but we did have some high winds here this spring. And in this thing, I've got 4 replications, 30-inch rows and 60-inch rows across the field. There's no difference in the standability so far. But, you know, the 30-inch rows didn't go down and 60-inch rows didn't go in. So I've got very limited experience with which to make that call. But there's like 20 farmers in the state of Iowa that's doing this particular trial, and I've not heard anybody else that has complained about them being more susceptible to breaking, stalk breakage or leaning over. So far, so good. That's about as well as I can qualify it. 35,000 per acre, but that's the same in 30 series, and 30-inch rows as it is in 60. It's just when you get to 60. And a little thing I did differently on mine is instead of putting them all in the same row, I've got a quasi-twin row. I made 2 passes, and I put a different population in one pass than I did the other pass, so that hopefully they wouldn't wind up side by side. They're 3 inches apart.
Jack, I have a question for you. For your tonnage that you removed the rice straw, what did you figure the value of that fertilizer that you had to put back on to replace what you lost when you sold that straw off your fields?
The question around the value of the raw straw, I think, the rye straw that I took off where I baled it and harvested it, that I only did that the first year, and I sold that at $65. And I later kind of determined, based on the prices and looking at what the nutrient removal rate of that straw would have been, it probably cost me $10 because it looked like the value was closer to $75 an acre, or a ton rather, than the 65. And since then, one more time, I have sold just a small, this year in fact, like 10% of it. He just wanted a few bales. I did bale some of that off, but I at least got the $75 a ton out of it this time. But I prefer to spread it and leave it all down.
How are you taking into account that credit for the nitrogen in the cover crops? And are the nitrogen modeling programs like Encirca and Precision, are they able to take that into account?
The nitrogen that I had in mind, there was biomass samples taken, collected, and they were sent to Iowa State for analysis. And so they measured the amount of nitrogen that was in that biomass. So that's the way I've got that. And then the other part of your question is Encirca and Climate and those able to account for that? In my opinion, is no. You got one down here.
Up front.
On your soybean planting burn down versus planting living, did you take that to yield and see any yield differences at all?
I should have mentioned, the question was around where I had the different burn down dates on the soybeans. I've got 5 years worth of data now. Well, no, I should say I've got 4 years worth of data where I had, one more time, 3 years of data of no cover versus cover. There was no yield difference. And then I've got 4 years worth of data of early termination versus planting green and terminating within 5 days. No yield difference, statistically anyway. Other people in the state that have been doing the same trials that I've done have seen actually some increase, small increase in theirs, that they delayed the termination. But for me, it's been equal. Oh, we got one back here.
So you were saying that cover crop holds more nitrogen. Have you seen that get released later in the season? Have you seen it tie up anything else with all the residue out there, or what have you seen there?
I'll answer the question this way. I think I've learned that I've been applying too much nitrogen. In that I've got a trial going this year that's focusing on nitrogen, just to try to better understand how much nitrogen either benefit from the cover crop I'm getting or how much I'm just literally applying too much. But last year I did a small sample, and it indicated that I could cut my nitrogen by at least 25 pounds, and the kind of the nitrogen to yield ratio, it got it down to around 0.6. And so I think that's I'm going to call that an observation. That's not data, because I didn't have enough replications to really say that that's true. This year I'm trying to get enough replications that I can see if it's truly there. It's another point that I should have made that I didn't make, though, is the coming back into corn. There's lots of conversation with cereal rye and allelopathy. I've never experienced allelopathy, and particularly where I strip till, because you've got that opened up. There's really not any cereal rye in that strip, and it's not there. But I've also done some no-till, and I've not experienced it there. This year, I've got a trial going on with Dr. Allison Robertson at Iowa State. She's looking at seedling diseases, and hopefully she'll have that results out this fall. But I've not really seen a problem with the cereal rye that a lot of the press talks about and a lot of the conversations there. So maybe some others would, but I've not. But I think one of the keys is that you need to address the nitrogen tie-up going to corn. So in my going to corn, in my burn down, I've been putting 30 units of nitrogen with that to kind of assist with that, to allow that rye to get decomposed without starving the corn plant. One over here.
Quite, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Jack, going back to your soybean trials of those years, a few questions. What spacing on your soybeans are you planting? And then the other thing is, how tall is the rye? And are you doing any rolling or, is it standing after you plant it?
What was the first part of your question?
What was your spacing?
Oh,
in
spacing
soybeans?
or population? I generally am seeding at 150,000 as far as the seeding rate on the soybeans. I have seeded green from, 2 or 3 feet, like you saw in the picture, up to over 6 feet. And again, I've seen no yield difference in either of those. And one thing I've learned is that material flows through the planter or flows through the drill much better green than it does if you kill it earlier, because when you kill it earlier, it's dry, it doesn't want to cut as easy, and it'll hang up and wrap on stuff, and so that's an issue that you can get into, particularly with that tall stuff. And so I've had good success planting green and getting it to flow through the machine.
So 30-inch or 10-inch?
I use 10-inch rows. Was that the
10-inch?
question?
Yeah.
But I've done both 30s and 10. Most of it I use a 10-inch. It's a no-till drill, but I've had some trials where I did 30-inch row as well. Last year I had a trial that had 30-inch rows, 10-inch rows, rolled and not rolled, and the only one that had a yield difference was the 30-inch row, 30-inch rows that were not rolled. The 10s, both rolled and not rolled, and the 30s rolled all equal yield.
And what was why do you think that was different, the 30-inch that were not rolled?
I don't know. It seemed like there was some disease or something that got into that piece of it that didn't. These are right side by side, so I just don't have a good explanation of why that particular one. And it wasn't huge, but it was statistically different.
Right down here.
Well, question is on, let's say if you want to plant cover crop, but you use like a residual herbicide on corn, like Balance Flex or maybe atrazine or something like that. How's the cover crop? Is there any test out there that proved the cover crop can, grow through that?
Yes, the question's around the herbicide usage on corn, or particularly when you go in, I assume when you're talking about interseeding back in there on these early stages. That's something you have to be particularly aware of. Pennsylvania State University has done quite a bit of work on the half-life of various herbicides, and so I try to choose some of those that have some of the shorter half-life that, by first week of June or something, it's getting down to a rate that's usually not a problem for the species that I've planted so far anyway. But Pennsylvania has done a lot of work on that.
Another one down here, Jack.
Jack, you referred to lowering your nitrogen application. Did you use late nitrate stock tests, or how did you test that? And where are you at on nitrogen? Are you at 150 units or more, or what?
Well, I think the other part of that question is what yield environment am I in? This is soil that's fully capable of 250 bushel yields. And so I had been more in the 200, and I have lowered it. Last year, I lowered it to 175 and had some at 150. And again, that's just an observation, but that 150 yield is as much as the 200 did. This year, I've got 200 and 150, but it's replicated, so I should be able to make a better judgment about is it different or not.
So are you using late nitrate
There is nitrate
tests?
stock. There was soil test early, and I picked those rates, and those are the rates, but we're looking at it both from the soil test, and then when we get here just a little bit later, we'll take some stock tests and do the stock nitrate test as well.
Okay. Have you done that?
The
Right.
stock nitrate we have not done this year yet.
Okay. No, not this year, but in the
In
past.
previous years, yes, but I didn't do it where I had the reduced nitrogen, so I can't make any judgment about
What
it.
were those running? Were they over 1,000?
I can't tell you. I don't remember.
Okay. Well,
I
that's
don't
fine.
remember. It,
In the back.
Yeah, Jack, I have a question. Do you see any correlation between how much growth you have on your rye in the fall correlate to a taller, more robust stand the next year?
If I understood your question correctly, is of having a good stand in the fall and that's got good growth on it, how does that translate into the growth of the next spring? Directly. If you've got good growth in the fall, it's got good root system, it takes off in the springs and get with it.
I got a question. Are you spring stripping or fall stripping for your corn?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what, spring or
you-
fall what?
Are you strip tilling in the spring or in the fall?
I've done some of both, but in as much as possible, I'm trying to do it in the spring.
Is that a knife or is that a coulter that you're running?
The one I'm doing in the spring is a Coulter machine. The difference, I'm really quite new to the strip tilling process, and if I want or need to put a lot of dry fertilizer down, I don't have dry fertilizer on my strip till bar yet. And I told somebody else earlier, I'm working on trying to get that machine to work properly. And so I'm pretty new at that, at doing it myself. I've been having the co-op do it, and they only do it in the fall, so that's why it winds up being in the fall some years.
Time for one more. If anybody's got one more question they'd like to ask Jack. One more in front here.
What's the rate of nitrogen and how you applying it, when?
At my historical rate of nitrogen, like I say, is I'd put about 125 to 150 down in the spring as anhydrous ammonia, and then I'd come back with whatever the balance in side dress in June, which would be, historically, would have been another 50 or 75 units, but this year, like I say, I backed it down.
Is that in anhydrous form or is that liquid?
Anhydrous, all of it anhydrous, except for the 30 units that I put on with burn down. That's 28%.
So do you see any loss in night crawlers, like you were talking about, all the tunnel effects with anhydrous?
I guess when I've dug around in there, where you put that anhydrous in, you've got about a 6-inch ball around there that, it pretty much destroys whatever's there. But I can go back 8 weeks later, and there's earthworms there like I never missed them, like I'd never disturbed them. So is there other microbes and whatever else that's being destroyed? I can't see them, so I don't know.
How about pocket gophers?
Pocket gophers.
That's notorious in no-till, strip-till.
Yeah, the pocket gophers, I think it must be enough to reduce their population, because I don't have a big problem with those where I'm using anhydrous. But I've had other fields where I wasn't using anhydrous, they get to be a problem.
Perfect. Well, how about another round of applause for Jack?